for Liberty. I'm your host, Adelle Nazarian. So the topic of today's forum is Iran and Hezbollah, a worldwide terror network. Today we are honored to have as our guest expert in this particular topic, Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi. Dr. Ottolenghi is a senior fellow at FDD and an expert at FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, otherwise known as CEFP. He's focused on Hezbollah's Latin America illicit threat networks and Iran's history of sanctions evasion. His research has examined Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, including its links to the country's energy sector and procurement networks. His areas of expertise also include the EU's Middle East policymaking, transatlantic relations, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Israel's domestic politics. Prior to joining FDD, Emanuele headed the Transatlantic Institute in Brussels and taught Israel studies at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. Dr. Ottolenghi, welcome to the program. Can you please give some, absolutely, thanks for being with us today. Can you please give some introductory remarks?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. Good morning to the West Coast, good afternoon to the East Coast, and good evening to Jerusalem. Before we start, I just want to say a word about current events. Unfortunately, the noble fight to save the life of Iran's wrestler has failed to achieve its goal. He's been sadly executed in the early hours of Saturday morning here. This highlights once more the evil nature of the Iranian regime, despite the fact that many in the West are peddling the notion that we're confronted with a rational, pragmatic, and moderate leadership that knows the limits of its power and wants to have just its place, its legitimate place in the world. It is not the case. This is just one the latest example of what the Iranian revolution is about. And to start our discussion, I want to begin precisely from that point. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not a country, it is a revolution. And every revolution in history does not just aspire to change the society or the country in which it takes roots, it has the goal of exporting its values and its worldview beyond the boundaries of the nation in which the revolution takes place. Once that revolution has been established and its achievements have been consolidated against internal enemies, real or imaginary, and that's what the Islamic Republic of Iran has done from the get-go. Hezbollah is perhaps its first and most successful project in that sense. Iran aspires to be a model for Islamic governance for other Islamic countries and views itself as the standard bearer of what it calls the oppressed of the earth, and therefore it views its revolutionary message not just relevant for Islamic societies, first and foremost Shia communities, but it also aspires to become the standard bearer of its fight against what it calls the global arrogance of the West for countries that are not Islamic at all. And so very early on, Iran has sought to establish alliances, cooperation, links with political movements and regimes across the world that, while not necessarily Islamic and not wedded to its Islamic ideology, would embrace that part of the revolutionary zeal in the fight against America and its influence in the world and the international global order established after World War II as the basis for the world we live in, and established by and on the foundations of what we can loosely define as a liberal international order, an order of rules, of treaties, of established dynamics of relations between countries. Iran has always sought to undermine that and undermine America's influence in the world. and naturally, in the process of seeking alliances and expanding to spread its message, Iran has looked at places like Africa and Latin America to advance its cause. As it happens, both continents, both Africa and Latin America, have small but well-established Shia expatriate communities, mostly of Lebanese. And so it has used Hezbollah not just as a tool to establish its presence and influence in Lebanon as a forward operating base in its fight against Israel, but it has also viewed these two regions, Africa and Latin America, as places for expansion. And of course, Latin America comes into play most importantly for Iran, because being in the backyard of the United States, it offered the opportunity of establishing forward operating bases in its ideological struggle against the United States. And this ideological struggle, of course, because Iran is a revolutionary regime driven by a millenarian religious ideology, this struggle is long-term, and Iran has waged it patiently over the course of the last 4 decades.
Thank you so much for that really amazing, concise introduction. We have so much ground to cover here, and absolutely, we send our condolences to Navid Akkari's family, and what a tragedy. So hopefully not many more people will have to die in vain before something is done to stop this treacherous regime. So let's jump right into it. You know, most of our audience, you touched upon this briefly, has, they think of Lebanon as the main domain of activity for Hezbollah. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how Hezbollah actually built its network in the Latin America region?
Absolutely. So it all started really with Iran, as I said, identifying Latin America as a fertile ground for the expansion of its revolutionary ideology. Iran realized very early on that Latin America had a number of, as I said, small but established Shia communities, most of them of Syro-Lebanese descent. Latin America was a destination for immigration from the Ottoman Middle East as early as the late 19th century. The vast majority of immigrants who came to Latin America were Christians, but over the years they were also Muslims, and part of the Muslim communities made up of Shia Muslims. Just an example, Brazil counts approximately 10 million citizens who are descendants of Lebanese or Syro-Lebanese immigrants. The vast majority, as I indicated, are Christians. Many of them are by now fully assimilated into Brazilian society. They no longer speak Arabic. They have intermarried with other groups and minorities. But approximately 10% of that community is made of Sunni Muslims, and a smaller percentage, about 150 to 200,000 of that community are Shia Muslims. Most of them are Lebanese. Some of them are Iranians. And so when Iran realized that there was this large community spread across the continent, it also understood that by sending missionaries, clerics initially, to serve these communities, to provide spiritual guidance, it had an opportunity to infiltrate the communities, indoctrinate them to the Islamic revolutionary ideology it propounded, and over time bring them over as proxies in its efforts to establish networks across Latin America. Now, in some cases, it did so directly. For example, in Argentina, the first country where Iran sent a clerical presence, that was done through directly an Iranian cleric who's become unfortunately famous or infamous later on. This is Mohsen Rabbani, somebody who came to Buenos Aires in early 1982, initially with a 3-month visa, then stayed on to become the cleric of the principal Shia mosque in Buenos Aires, the Mesquita Al Tawhid, in the neighborhood of Flores in Buenos Aires. Rabbani was later implicated, as many of you know, in the terror attacks against the Israeli embassy and then the Jewish Cultural Center, the AMIA, in 92 and 94. But in other places, perhaps because of the overwhelming presence of Lebanese in these communities, it relied on Hezbollah to do this kind of outreach. And so, you know, just to give you another example, the earliest Iranian presence in Brazil is from about 1988-89, when an Iraqi-born Shia cleric who was previously active in East Africa, spreading the Iranian revolutionary values in the 1980s, came and established a cultural center in a mosque. This is a cleric named Talib al-Khazraji, who to this very day runs a cultural center in Sao Paulo. And that community has grown to bring in numerous Islamic clerics from both Lebanon and Iran. One of them, Bilal Mohsen Wehbi, was sanctioned by the US Treasury in 2010 as Hezbollah's chief representative for Latin America. Others are Iranian. The mosque in Sao Paulo is large enough to host both an Arabic language and a Farsi Friday sermon for their community. So Iran has used these communities as a springboard to infiltrate, to bring a presence of clerics. Sometimes it's used the pretext of sending meat inspector for halal meat to various countries to get visas.
Interesting.
Yes, and then the clerics bring in, of course, the families, establish mosques, and that becomes then the basis for expansion.
But
and once, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, but essentially what they're doing is they're exporting their version of the Islamic Revolution.
That is correct. And what they're doing is basically a miniature reproduction of the Dawah system they used through Hezbollah in Lebanon and later on in Iraq with the various Shia groups that sprang out after the defeat and removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, to create a whole infrastructure of religious, educational, cultural, and charitable institutions that have served the function of turning these communities into loyal followers, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through coercion, of the specific Islamic version propounded by the Iranian Revolution. And over time, this model has been reproduced pretty much across every single country in Latin America. Today, you find Iranian trained clerics running Islamic centers in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, Brazil, that I already mentioned, in Bolivia, in Central America, even fairly recently in Cuba, a country that is usually not particularly friendly to religion and missionary work.
You know, this is fascinating. Thank you so much. It's very similar, actually, to what, if I may say, the Muslim Brotherhood has done in its own right. Just in the opposite religious view, obviously, they're mostly Sunni instead of Shia. I want to ask you, if I may, you know, the long-standing relationship between the Iranian regime and Hezbollah. How did this relation? I guess what would you say they have in common? What are the commonalities that have allowed for both these groups to come together, really, and to expand the way that they have?
You know, they have many things in common at all levels. Some of the leading clerics in Hezbollah studied in the same seminaries where the clerical revolutionaries of Iran studied, so they have personal connections. You know, the Shia community in Lebanon, Syria, and the ones in Iran have historically had connections and exchanges. But beyond that, we need to remember one important element that perhaps trumps them all, and that is that Hezbollah was created as a branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The Iranian regime's principle, foundational principle, is the idea of velayat al-faqih, right? The notion that there is a supreme leader who is the shadow of God on earth, who represents God and interprets God's will on earth, and acts as the supreme interpreter in all matters pertaining to the polity, to how a just Islamic society is run. And clerics within that system owe their allegiance to the supreme leader, who is at the height of a hierarchy of jurists who implement this vision. The general secretary of Hezbollah and the entire clerical structure that runs Hezbollah in Lebanon abides by that principle and has an oath of loyalty to the supreme leader. So they are, for all intents and purposes, an extension of the Iranian state, and that's what binds them together.
Thank you. So we're going to go down further the line a little bit. On September 8th, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, announced that they had sanctioned the former Lebanese government's ministers, Youssef Binyanous and Ali Hassan Khalil, both of whom provided material support to Hezbollah and engaged in corruption. You know, these designations underscored how some of the Lebanese politicians have conspired with Hezbollah at the expense of the Lebanese people and institutions, which we see with these, the protests and the horrific economic situation there, which actually is mirroring what's happening in Iran. Is this enough? And if not, is it enough to just sanction them? And if not, what more can be done by the United States to put pressure on Hezbollah officials around the world?
That's a very, very important question. And the facts are that Hezbollah, as the tool of Iran in Lebanon, has, over the past 4 decades, gradually evolved from being the Iranian arm to overtake the Shia community in Lebanon. As many of you recall, at the time when Hezbollah was established during the Lebanese civil war, the Shia community had a party called Amal, who tended to be more secular. Amal and Hezbollah actually clashed several times over the years. Hezbollah sought to undermine Amal and provide a more, what they thought, advocated was a more authentic, religious, assertive Shia independence. And they turned themselves, of course, as the principal tool in Iran's war against Israel to dislodge Israel from South Lebanon. From there, they moved to become the main player in Lebanese politics and did the bidding of both Iran and Syria. Many of you remember that Hezbollah was responsible for the assassination of the late Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, and perhaps less known, but fairly publicized, is the fact that in addition to murdering him, Hezbollah was behind the killing of numerous other intellectuals, journalists, politicians, anyone who stood in the way of their ascent to the monopoly and control over the country. By now, in 2020, Hezbollah dominates Lebanese politics. It's the kingmaker, and has ensured that it also has a grip over the financial system of Lebanon. Why is that? Because Hezbollah has grown over the years from an operation that cost approximately $100 to $200 million a year to something that vastly exceeds the $1 billion budget frequently cited in open sources as what Hezbollah currently needs to run its operations. Part of that money comes from Iran, of course, and it comes in suitcases flown directly from Tehran to Beirut or through Damascus airport. But a significant and growing chunk of that budget comes from Hezbollah's illicit operations overseas and also donations from overseas. And so Hezbollah needs the complicity of the financial and the economic system of Lebanon. Therefore, it's not enough to have a presence in the government or to be able to intimidate politicians. It also needs to infiltrate and have the active complicity of port authorities, of customs, of intelligence, of the army, and of the banks and the economic and commercial sector. And that's what Hezbollah has done. So designating, sanctioning two former ministers, as well as a sprinkle of financial institutions, as Treasury has done in the past, is very important. But more needs to be done to go after. We need to understand that Lebanon is no longer, if it ever was, an independent state. It is a tool in the hands of Iran's proxy on the Eastern Mediterranean.
So speaking to that, more needs to be done, right? We
Correct.
see international companies such as South Africa's MTN, which is a telecommunications company, having operations in Iran, Lebanon, and Latin America. In this particular case with MTN, the company has been used by the so-called reformist moderates like Mohammed Aref to enrich themselves and their families. So, I mean, can you tell us maybe of some other examples of Hezbollah using its terror and political relationships to promote this sort of corruption?
Absolutely. So in the case of Iran, and MTN is a great example, there are other companies that are not necessarily owned by the regime or even by the Revolutionary Guards, but that have kind of an organic connection to the regime, that do the regime's bidding abroad. And Venezuela is a great case in point, because there you had over the years companies as the construction conglomerate Caisson, the car maker, automaker Iran Khodro, the banking sector with banks established, and all of these operations served a variety of functions. One was, of course, to strengthen the connection between the Venezuelan regime and the Iranian regime. Another one was to facilitate sanction evasion and procurement, the movement of money, and so on. They also facilitated the transfer of personnel to Latin America in the case of all of these constructions projects that Iran got involved in on behalf of the Venezuelan regime. It allowed Iran to send architects, engineers, construction workers, and some of these people clearly were not there just to build affordable housing. So that's what Iran does. Now, Hezbollah is not a state, although it relies, of course, on the support of Iran. And what Hezbollah does is that it ensures that local government cooperate or turn a blind eye to its activities by greasing the wheel of corruption. And so by buying off politicians as well as public officials in every branch of government that is required to let these operations run, Hezbollah buys influence, and it will also encourage members of its community to become politically active, to cultivate friendships, and of course to use their business advantages to provide benefits to officials in these countries. And it really doesn't matter the political inclination of these countries. We see this model being used in countries like Venezuela or Bolivia under Morales, where the regime was, of course, an ally to Iran, but we see it also in places like Paraguay, like Brazil, and Argentina, even during Macri, where the government was a lot more closely aligned with the United States. The purpose of these activities is, as I said, through corruption, to buy access, to buy influence, and leverage it when necessary to protect Hezbollah's operation from the prying eyes of investigators, from attempts by the United States to build cooperative investigations against corruption, against money laundering, and other activities Hezbollah is involved in.
So this is so interesting. So you mentioned that Hezbollah is essentially the kingmaker, right? They are the one that they control the Lebanese government, right? And the politicians are actively engaged in acts of corruption. So by that, we could probably, it's safe to say that the Lebanese politicians are an extension of Hezbollah, right, in a sense?
To a large extent, yes, to a large extent. And even the ones who, intuitively we would assume are on the opposite side of Hezbollah, will engage in deals and in political wheeling and dealing, because at the end of the day, these politicians do not represent political constituencies. They represent communities, sects within the Lebanese confessional puzzle, and they all have their own chunk in their own piece of the pie they need to protect. So it's a bit of, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, even if they have perhaps ideologically, politically, religiously vast differences. They will work together. And by the way, we see an extension of this abroad, overseas, where oftentimes Hezbollah, in running its own illicit financial networks, relies on Lebanese expatriates who are not Shia. They're Sunni, they're Christians, they're Druze, and you'll be surprised that there have been some cases where you see cooperation even with members of the Jewish community. So they are very ecumenical when it comes to making their dirty money. And the motivations for those who cooperate with them may be multiple. Sometimes it's opportunism, sometimes it's greed, sometimes it's ideology, it's a hatred for America. In recent years, we have seen oftentimes Christians and Druze in Latin America siding with Hezbollah in these schemes because they say that Hezbollah is fighting in Syria against the Islamic State to defend their own Christian and Druze brethren. And so they prefer Hezbollah, Iran, and Assad to what they see as the most the most pressing threat to their own extended clans and families. And so
you kind of answered it.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, that's so interesting. So I was going to ask you how closely Hezbollah works with its networks of business people in Latin America and the lines of business they're involved in. But it seems like you have answered that question when you told us that they have members of different communities, religious communities, non-religious communities, and they kind of use those individuals as proxies then to kind of carry out their work.
That is correct. That is correct. And we know, and we have known for over a decade now, that Hezbollah's external security operation, which is basically the branch of Hezbollah in charge of overseas operations, basically terrorism, has what is called a business affairs component. The business affair component, which is run by very senior members of Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Iran, and Iraq, is in charge of supervising a vast global network of businesses and business contacts that facilitate most commonly money laundering operations on behalf of organized crime. Those operations are used to finance Hezbollah. Now, the people involved in those operations are not necessarily members of Hezbollah. They're more often linked to Hezbollah in a variety of ways. It may be family links to members of Hezbollah. It may be members of the Lebanese communities who, for the variety of reasons I detailed before, feel they need or want to help people who may not necessarily identify with Hezbollah, but see an opportunity to make easy and abundant money by participating in these operations. What's interesting, though, and this is, I think, important, is this. When you look at organized crime in the world, you know that organized criminal cartels tend to be territorial. Yes. And so sooner or later, as these cartels expand, they come into clash with competitors and blood runs copiously on the street. Latin America, of course, is perhaps the prime example of that. When it comes to networks linked to Hezbollah, even if they're not run by people who are members of Hezbollah, but they have a certain degree of association, you do not see this kind of violence. And that is because no matter how loosely connected these business people are, it is a hierarchical, centralized structure, tightly controlled from above, that assigns tasks and contracts to people all over the world and coordinates it at a global level. And so you rarely have the type of conflict and violence among the members of these vast networks that you find when you look at just regular organized crime.
That's really, really very interesting and important. You're absolutely correct. They don't eat their own, so to speak.
Correct, correct. So, you will have occasionally a Lebanese trafficker who's assassinated because they lost a shipment and they couldn't pay the money back, or because they snitched on their members. But even that is very rare, because remember that what you have here is not just a bond of ideology and religion. These networks are often built on large extended family links, right? So, for example, one of the most famous Hezbollah families in Latin America is the Barakat clan in the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. There are 3 brothers, Barakat brothers, active in the tri-border area. They have a 4th brother in Lebanon who is a member, who's a cleric and a member of the Shura Council of Hezbollah. So one family member is within the leadership of the party. The other 3 brothers run businesses in Angola, in Brazil, in Paraguay, in Argentina, in Chile, and they rely on siblings, cousins, uncles, nephews, and nieces as this empire expands. So
all over the place.
Right. And so when somebody betrays the network, they're not just betraying, or is asked to betray the network, they're not just betraying an ideology. This is not just a KGB officers who's bought over to the West in exchange for a safe passage to the family and a better life. You have to betray your family. The connection of blood, of betraying your kith and kin, makes it extremely difficult, and that's why these networks are so difficult to penetrate and untangle.
Thank you so much. So we're going to shift a little bit. We learned earlier this week that the Kingdom of Bahrain announced that they'll be establishing full diplomatic ties with Israel. What impact do you think these peace deals are having on Iran and Hezbollah's terror networks? They must be a little scared.
Well, clearly, this is a huge setback for the Iranians in the Gulf. And generally speaking, it's actually interesting to see how these vast communities around the world respond to the political developments whenever they impact Iran. I spend a considerable amount of time monitoring these networks through a variety of platforms. And when you look at them on social media, for example, when Qasem Soleimani was vaporized on January 3rd, not only did you see that Iranian embassy in Latin America organized memorials, had a sort of a condolence book to sign at the embassy, but you saw that some of the Shia communities organized memorial services for Soleimani. Members of these communities posted eulogies, photographs, and memorial commentaries on their social media accounts. And you're seeing the same type of reaction now with these peace deals. What you're also seeing, of course, and this is another element we haven't touched upon, but it's an important one. Iran, being what it is, has invested heavily in propaganda. Very much like Russia did, or the Soviet Union did in its heyday, and Russia is doing today. They have their own network of media outreach in foreign languages to push their agenda. And so in Latin America, they established Hispan TV, a television network that is run out of Spain. It's registered in Spain, but it operates mainly in Latin America. It was launched in 2012 jointly by the late dictator of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, and the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. It uses a lot of the same journalists that work for other ideological outlets in Latin America, such as Telesur, which is the television of the Bolivarian regime in Venezuela. And they basically push out the Iranian point of view in Spanish to millions of Spanish viewers using a multiplicity of platforms, from satellite to social media. So you are also seeing this now as these deals are being signed. And if you tune into Hispan TV, you will hear the Iranian narrative of why these deals are a betrayal the Palestinian cause. They are a betrayal of the Arab cause. They're a stab in the back in the service of global arrogance. They're a Zionist plot, and all of these catchword phrases and themes that are typical of the revolutionary conspiratorial message that Iran pushes out to the world.
Thank you. That's very alarming, but doesn't come as a surprise. Let's pivot back a bit to Hezbollah and talk specifically about their operations in Latin America. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Hezbollah is doing there? I mean, who are their strongest allies that are there really? Like aside from Iran, and you had mentioned a few more, are there like, who would you say are their strongest allies that, let's say the US government were to, focus in on, or the people need to focus in on so they know exactly who the links to look for?
So that's a great question. And as I briefly indicated before, these networks are present in pretty much every country in Latin America. Because they're chiefly involved in terror finance, so they basically are terror finance networks that launder money on behalf of criminal networks and take a commission out of their services. A lot of these networks thrive in peripheral areas of the continent alongside borders, which in Latin America are notoriously porous and poorly patrolled. They rely on corruption in order to ensure that authorities look the other way. And so because you have those conditions pretty much everywhere in Latin America, that means that for the Hezbollah networks, it matters less who is in power. Now, there are, of course, countries where the regime is friendly to Iran. That is, of course, the most obvious example is Venezuela. Bolivia under Evo Morales was another place. Ecuador during the government of Rafael Correa. In general, the ALBA countries. And by the way, the ALBA countries, the Bolivarian alliance of Latin America that includes a lot of Caribbean islands and Hispanic countries, has been a target of Iranian penetration for years, both at the government level and at the NGO level. So Iran will seek to foster alliances with friendly governments, will also seek to foster alliances with political movements, whether they're in government or opposition, that are ideologically aligned with its worldview. So if they are in power, like in Venezuela, the relationship is fairly above surface and institutional. If they're not, like the cases of like the case of Brazil now, where some of their main interlocutors are in the Labour Party that was unseated because of past corruption scandals, they will cultivate those relationships. They will work with indigenous movements. They will work with Marxist, Leninist movements. They will really work with anyone who needs financial support to assert themselves, who is aligned ideologically with Iran's intense hatred for Israel and America, and they will leverage those connections to expand influence. They will even, of course, cooperate with separatist movements and terror groups that are active in Latin America. And most importantly, they are active and cooperating with organized crime. Mm-hmm. And so once again, you need to look at how organized crime interfaces with the politics of each country. What you discover oftentimes is that even in countries such as Paraguay, where the government is closely aligned with the United States and friendly to the United States, the level of corruption is so pervasive that Iran finds allies within the structure of the ruling elites, not so much for ideological reasons, but for money and opportunities.
Wow. So like, yeah, you mentioned earlier how Hezbollah used to run on a few $100 million. Now it's multi-billion-dollar operation, right?
Correct.
Internationally. So I guess what we don't know is how does Hezbollah actually fund these operations? We know that the money comes from Iran, obviously, and other groups, but where is the money coming from?
So these vast financial networks that Iran had, that Hezbollah has established over the course of decades, have increasingly become attractive to organized crime. And the reason is fairly simple. Again, it goes back to how organized crime operates. If you are, let's say, a Mexican or a Colombian cartel, you have, of course, monopoly or a certain monopoly over the production of the illicit substance you trade in those cases, cocaine. You may have control over the routes through which this merchandise travels to its markets, chiefly the United States in the case of Latin American cartels. But you do not necessarily have relationships all over the world with other criminal syndicates to market your merchandise far and wide, and even less so you have the networks and the infrastructure that is capable to then repatriate the monies, right? When you sell cocaine to a buyer in Europe or in Australia, you may have that connection, but you do not necessarily have the way to then bring the money back to all the way to Colombia. That's where Hezbollah comes in. Hezbollah has a presence through this network of communities pretty much everywhere. They operate, as I said, not just in Latin America, but in Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, clearly, and in the Far East as well. And so what they provide is a service, right? I always say to people, they're a little bit like the DHL, Western Union, and Amazon of crime in this sense.
That's great.
Hezbollah provides the criminal equivalent of a DHL or Federal Express service. You have a bulk shipment of cocaine to send from Colombia to the Netherlands. Hezbollah has the connections to take your shipment, bring it to the Netherlands through these guys, buying corrupt officials' support, and having it delivered to the buyer in Europe. They also can act as an intermediary like Amazon. They will buy the product from you and sell it on to their connections in distant markets. And finally, they act like Western Union. Through their network of front companies and commercial endeavors, they can move money back through what is called trade-based money laundering. You see all of these companies spread around the world that move thousands of mobile phones, PlayStation consoles, perfumes, any commercial item. And what you see is legitimate trade. But what the Hezbollah businessmen and the drug trafficker or cartel in Latin America see is the repatriation of the value of bricks of cocaine sold in distant markets. That's what they do. And in doing so, because it's a risky business, they take a significant commission, which ranges between 8 and 15%. So just to give you an example, one large network that was targeted by DEA in Colombia in 2011 with an indictment and a variety of legal actions that led to the demise of a Lebanese bank that was involved in the network. That network was laundering up to $200 million a month of money from drug proceeds for a Colombian and a Mexican cartel. So if you take, let's say, 10% commission from 200 million a month, that's 20 million a month times 12 is 240 million a year.
And that one specific,
just one network. Now, not all that money goes back to Hezbollah. Of course, the various members of the network that are moving the money and the merchandise take their own cut. You need money to wheel, to grease the wheels of corruption, to pay off politicians, to pay off this, to pay off that. The members of the community have a high standard of life. They need to show themselves as standing, upright citizens, contributing to charity, being presidents of the local Rotary Club, and so on. All of that takes money. But at the end of the process, there is still a significant chunk that is left for Hezbollah and that is repatriated. One other network that was taken down in 2016 in a joint European-US operation that was called Operation Cedar was providing up to 40 million euro a month in funds to buy weapons for Hezbollah in Syria. So once again, here you see how this is not just money laundering and drug trafficking. At the end of the day, the money goes to fund terror operations and activities. And what's even more important, perhaps not as well understood, is this: the business affair component is an integral constituent part of the external security organization. So when the ESO decides that it wants to launch a terror attack in some faraway place, it will activate these terror finance networks, not necessarily to carry out the attack, but a cell that comes in to blow up, say, the Panama Canal, as Hezbollah tried unsuccessfully to do in the last few years, needs the explosives, needs safe houses, needs a cover, usually commercial, needs fake documents. It needs a lot of services and provisions that the local terror finance network will provide. So they double up, not just as financiers for Hezbollah's needs, but also when needed, they facilitate the planning of terror attacks.
Yeah, 20 million a month is very tempting, but I will never sell my soul. So on to the next question. A couple of weeks ago, there was a pro-Palestinian rally on the streets of New York City. During the rally, many of the protesters are waving Hezbollah flags. You know, this is a very important question too. Does Hezbollah have a presence in America? We know the Muslim Brotherhood does, but Hezbollah too?
Absolutely. We have by now several cases that have been prosecuted or being prosecuted in U.S. courts, where both Hezbollah financiers and, more ominously, external security operation agents were arrested and brought to justice. And in the cases of the external security operation operatives, these were Lebanese nationals who came to the United States as legal immigrants, obtained a green card, and obtained citizenship. And once they were dual nationals, Hezbollah activated them for a variety of activities, which usually included both commercial illicit finance activities and surveillance of targets with a view to planning attacks. The Panama Canal attack is one such case, where it was a US Lebanese national who was dispatched by Hezbollah to Panama to scout the US embassy, the Israeli embassy, and the canal to identify vulnerabilities in view of an attack. So we have a presence. And what's perhaps more concerning is that in addition to the sprinkle of operatives, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of small companies established and incorporated across the United States that partake in the money laundering schemes that Hezbollah runs globally to finance its activities. So they're involved in money laundering for drug traffickers and for other criminal activities, and they're using the US homeland, the US financial system, to run these operations.
Wow. So we're running low on time here a little bit. I want to ask two more questions of you. The one is, does Hezbollah provide protection and other types of support to businesses that have ties to the Islamic Republic in Latin America or other parts of the world?
So that's a difficult question to answer, because through open sources it's hard to identify or sort of definitively prove this, but there is evidence that a number of military operatives of Hezbollah who usually have a Quds force handler are present across Latin America. Getting weapons in Latin America is fairly easy, certainly in some areas of Latin America. I'm very familiar with the tri-border area, and if I wanted to, I know where I could just walk in to a shop and buy myself a semi-automatic weapon for cash, no questions asked. I know how I would easily smuggle it across the border.
Very different from in America, by the way, where we require checks, background checks. And
well, we're not going to get into that question today. But just to add, just to rub it in a bit, some of the gun running operations that Hezbollah has been implicated in rely on the legal purchase of weapons from US stores,
Hmm.
a small quantity at a time. And then these weapons are dismantled, disassembled, and hidden either in used cars or packaged alongside electronics, and then they're shipped down to Latin America, where the buyers, usually connected to the Hezbollah network, will then provide these weapons to organized crime. So given their involvement in gun running, the facility by which you can, these by which you can get access to weapons, the general lawlessness you find in many of these countries, the likelihood that Hezbollah has its own security apparatus in place is very high. I can tell you that at least when it comes to their own institutions, so their mosques, their schools, they do have a security apparatus that they run on their own in place to protect those facilities from the prying eyes of people like me.
Thank you. Does Hezbollah have ties to Marxist guerrillas like FARC and similar
Absolutely,
in Latin America?
absolutely, no doubt. Both Hezbollah and Iran. And again, you can see this happening at all levels with Hezbollah proxies across the political systems of Latin America, infiltrating the political system, putting their own people, running for offices, local government, national government, elected positions, being active in political parties, connecting to revolutionary movements, joining forces with these movements where they can. For example, in Salvador, the Iranian operation there is closely linked to the Frente Farabundo Martí. I mentioned Cuba, where clearly the Iranian presence has been authorized by the Cuban regime. You see it in Nicaragua. You see it obviously in Venezuela, where in addition to free access, the Hezbollah and Iran have benefited from Venezuela issuing passports to their operatives, Venezuelan passports. So it really depends on the nature of the political system in which they operate, but generally speaking, it is their strategy to find and build alliances with those leaders or movements that are most closely aligned ideologically with their own worldview.
Thank you. I mean, this has been so incredible. And I know we've just literally scratched the tip of the iceberg, right? With your amazing knowledge and expertise in this and other areas. I want to ask now, Emanuele, how can our audience support your research? Would love to know ways that they can, support what you're doing and to become more knowledgeable through you about what threats face our world.
Well, first of all, thank you. Any help is always welcome. I think educating your public to these issues is very important. Understanding that these networks and these activities are not just far away in Lebanon, the Middle East, or even Latin America, but they affect us most directly, very close to home, here in the United States. Getting this type of knowledge and understanding can empower your public to reach out and ask questions to their elected representatives at the local government, at the national government, in Congress, writing letters, presenting facts, asking probing questions is very important. Of course, leveraging connections in the Iranian American community to educate this important community to the dangers that these activities pose to them. First and foremost, as you probably know, I have some Iranian American colleagues at FTD, and the Iranian regime does not view us as just intellectual adversaries. So anyone who is of Iranian background is potentially a target of this regime. So it is also for our own personal safety that getting this knowledge and spreading it around is extremely important. And so this kind of occasion is very helpful to get the message across, educate the public, and hopefully get them to become more active and involved in pursuing these matters.
Great. And where can they find your research? And is there a place that they can go to check out your research and support your research?
Absolutely. I all encourage you to come and become acquainted with FDD's website, which is at www.fdd.org, where you can find my work and the work of my incredible colleagues. This is a team effort. You will find experts on Iran's missile system, Lebanon's political system, Iran's illicit finance, human rights violation, and the list is long, and there's plenty of great material. If you, of course, want to support FTD, there is a way to do so through the website. You can reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter at Ottolenghi, Ottolenghi. I welcome supporters. I get a lot of bots from the Iranian regime following me these days. So friends are welcome too. And generally speaking, becoming educated through our research and becoming active on its basis will help move our agenda greatly.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Iranian Americans for Liberty, thank you to everyone for joining today's conversation with Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi. Please make sure that you are following us on Twitter as well at Liberty Iranian. I just want to also note your last name, Ottolenghi, is Italian. Does it mean 8 days?
No, it doesn't. Eight is correct, but the meaning of the name is in dispute. It's probably the mangled version of a village from where the family came from. But yes, it is an Italian Jewish name from the northwest of Italy.
Very, very cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We're so thrilled to have had you. Have a great afternoon, and we will see you soon.